The rain had been falling for 3 straight days, and with each drop that struck the window of her apartment, Clara felt the same heaviness pressing down on her chest. It wasn't just the weather. It was the weight of everything she had left unsaid at T34. Clara had built a life that, from the outside, looked picture-perfect. A steady job at a publishing house. A quiet, tastefully decorated apartment in the city. Friends who respected her for her calmness and composure. Yet inside, she was a storm, one that had been brewing since the day she turned her back on her hometown and the people who raised her. She hadn't spoken to her father in 11 years. That it wasn't a single fight that tore them apart, but years of growing distance, silent resentment, and unspoken pain. He had been a strict man, cold, disciplined, obsessed with control. Her mother, too fragile to challenge him, had watched helplessly as Clara's spirit withered under his expectations. When she turned 23, Clara finally left. She left behind not only her father's house, but everything that tied her to the small town where her laughter once echoed down the street. She never looked back, until now. It started with a phone call. "Clara, it's Mrs. Fields." From back home. Clara froze when she heard the name. Her old neighbor, an elderly woman who used to bake pies and gossip with her mother over the fence. "I don't want to alarm you," Mrs. Fields said gently, "but your father, he's not doing so well. He had a fall last week. He's been asking for you." Clara didn't respond. Her mind went blank, and her heart began to race in ways she hadn't felt in years. "He's stubborn," Mrs. Fields continued, "but he's still your father. I think he'd like to see you before it's too late." That night, Clara sat awake for hours, staring at the ceiling. Every reason not to go flashed through her head like lightning. "He never cared about me. He doesn't deserve my forgiveness. I built a life without him." But beneath those thoughts, there was another voice, smaller, quieter, but relentless. "What if this is your only chance to say goodbye?" 3 days later, she was driving down the same road she once swore she'd never take again. The closer she got to her childhood town, the tighter her chest became. The stores looked smaller. The field seemed emptier. Even the air smelled different, familiar, but distant, like an old song she had forgotten the lyrics to. When she finally reached the house, she sat in her car for a full minute before stepping out. The place hadn't changed much. The same creaky porch, the same old oak tree, the same windows where she used to press her face, waiting for her mother to come home from work. But everything felt faded. She knocked on the door softly, not knowing if he'd even answer. After a long pause, the door opened. Her father stood there, thinner than she remembered. His once broad shoulders hunched and frail. His eyes, those stern, unyielding eyes, were still sharp, but behind them, something had dimmed. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, he said, "You came." It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't even relief. It was a statement of disbelief, like he'd stopped expecting good things to happen long ago. Clara nodded. "Mrs. Fields called me. I told her not to," he said, his tone flat. "Of course you did." The silence between them stretched like a wound that never healed. But Clara stepped inside anyway. The house smelled of old wood and dust, mixed with the faint trace of her mother's perfume, a ghost that refused to fade. "Your room's still upstairs," her father said, as if she were just visiting from college. "If you plan on staying." "I don't," Clara replied automatically. He only nodded. That night, she couldn't sleep. The walls seemed to whisper old arguments, old tears, old moments of love that had curdled into bitterness. She thought about her mother, gone for 8 years now, and how she'd never had the courage to visit her grave. Around midnight, she heard coughing from the other room. It was rough and hoarse, the sound of a man who had spent his life swallowing too many words. Instinctively, she got up, filled a glass of water, and walked to his door. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, hunched forward, one hand clutching his chest. "Here," she said softly. Handing him the water, he took it without looking at her. "Didn't expect you to care." Clara sighed. "You always think people don't care, but maybe you just never let them." For a brief second, she saw something flicker in his expression, pain, regret, maybe even shame. But then it was gone, buried under the same wall of pride that had always kept them apart. "I don't need your pity," he said, "and I don't have any to give." It wasn't until the next morning that she realized how much she meant those words. They following days were strange, quiet, tense, but with a softness that hadn't existed before. She cooked for him. He tried to thank her once, but couldn't bring himself to say it out loud. Instead, he muttered, "You always oversalt things." And she smiled despite herself. One afternoon, while cleaning the living room, Clara found an old photo album tucked behind the bookshelf. It was covered in dust, its edges frayed. When she opened it, her breath caught. There were pictures of her as a little girl, smiling, laughing, standing beside her father in front of the same oak tree. His arm was around her. Her hands trembled as she flipped the pages. The more she looked, the more she saw something she had forgotten. He had loved her once. Maybe in his own flawed way, maybe imperfectly, but love was there, buried under all the silence. When he found her staring at the photos, he didn't speak for a while. Then, quietly, he said, "She made me take those." "Mom." He nodded. "Said one day you'd want to remember. I told her you wouldn't." "Why would you think that?" Clara asked, her voice shaking. "Because you were too much like me," he said simply. "And people like me don't forgive easily." It was the first honest thing he had said in years. For the first time since she arrived, Clara felt tears sting her eyes. Not from anger, but from grief. Grief for the years wasted in pride, the conversations that never happened, the love that had been buried under layers of stubbornness. That night, as the rain returned and tapped softly on the roof, Clara sat by his bedside. She didn't know if forgiveness was possible, but for the first time, she wanted to try. Months passed after Liam's accident, but the guilt clung to Evelyn like a second skin. She had tried to move on, throwing herself into work, pretending to be fine, yet every mirror reflected not her face, but the pain she'd caused. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, Evelyn sat in her apartment scrolling through old messages. Her finger hovered over Liam's name, still in her phone, though she hadn't deleted it out of some strange self-punishment. She clicked the chat open. "Liam, you always say forever, but I think your forever comes with an expiration date." "Evelyn, don't say that. I love you." She shut her eyes, her chest tightening. She wanted to believe she had done what was right, that leaving him was necessary for her own happiness. But now that happiness felt hollow. One rainy night, Evelyn received an unexpected email. It was from Liam's sister, Clara. "Hi, Evelyn. I'm not sure if you've heard, but Liam's still struggling. He's not the same since the accident. He doesn't blame you, but maybe seeing you would help him heal." Clara, her hands trembled. She'd avoided that possibility for months. Seeing him again would mean facing the storm she'd created. Yet something in her heart whispered that maybe this was her chance at redemption. When Evelyn arrived at the rehabilitation center, the sterile scent of antiseptic and faint piano music filled the halls. She found Liam sitting near the window, a book open on his lap. His once vibrant eyes now seemed distant, like he was somewhere between reality and memory. "Liam," she said softly. He turned. For a moment, she thought he might look away, but instead, he gave a small, tired smile. "Hey, you came." Her throat closed up. "I should have come sooner." He nodded slightly. "Maybe, but you're here now." They talked for hours. About meaningless things at first. Work, the weather, Clara's engagement, anything but the accident. But eventually, silence fell. It was heavy, unspoken truth pressing between them. "Liam," she whispered, "I'm so sorry. I ruined everything." He looked down at his hands, then back up. "I don't hate you, Evelyn. I tried to, but I realized holding on to hate only hurts me." Tears streamed down her face. "You should hate me." "I did," he admitted. "But people break sometimes. And maybe you just broke before I did." It was forgiveness, not full, not clean, but real enough to make her crumble. That night, walking home in the drizzle, Evelyn felt something shift inside her. It wasn't relief, it was responsibility. She wanted to make amends not just to Liam, but to herself. She began volunteering at a trauma recovery group, helping others process loss, regret, and guilt. Listening to strangers tell their stories reminded her of Liam's resilience, his quiet strength that never left him even in the darkest days. One day, she came home to find a letter waiting on her doorstep. It was from Liam. "Evelyn, you once told me pain makes people colder, but I think pain can also make people kinder. I've forgiven you, not because it's easy, but because I want to heal. I hope you find peace too. L." Her tears fell onto the paper, smudging the ink. For the first time in years, she smiled, not because everything was fixed, but because healing had finally begun. 2 years later, Evelyn stood at a small community event where survivors shared stories of recovery. When it was her turn to speak, her hands trembled, but her voice was steady. "I once hurt someone deeply," she began, "and I spent years trying to escape my guilt. But I learned that running from pain doesn't erase it. Only facing it does." The crowd listened, silent and still. "We can't undo what's done," she continued, "but we can choose who we become because of it." After the talk, a young woman approached her. "Your story, it reminded me of mine," she said, eyes wet. "Maybe I can start healing too." Evelyn smiled softly. "You already have." That night, Evelyn walked home beneath the city lights. For years, those same streets had felt like reminders of her failure. But now, they shimmered differently. Not with sorrow, but with hope. At a cafe window, she saw her reflection, older, gentler, wiser. Life had scarred her, but it had also shaped her into something stronger. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "Hey, it's Liam. I just wanted to say thank you. For visiting, for everything. I'm doing better now. Maybe someday we can grab coffee as friends." She laughed softly, typing back, "I'd like that." The next morning, as sunlight spilled across her apartment, Evelyn looked out over the city. She thought of how far she'd come, from guilt and despair to grace and growth. Sometimes, the universe breaks you to rebuild you. And though her scars would never fade completely, they had turned into something beautiful. Proof that even broken hearts can learn to beat again. Evelyn whispered to herself, "What goes around comes back with lessons." And she smiled, because she finally understood that forgiveness, both given and received, was the purest form of karma. Years passed. The seasons shifted over Evelyn's life like soft brushstrokes, painting her world in calmer tones. The chaos that once ruled her mind had softened into a quiet rhythm, not perfect, but peaceful. She had learned to live with her past, not as a wound, but as a teacher. Her work at the Trauma Recovery Center had grown into something bigger than she imagined. People began to come not just for therapy, but for connection, for hope. Evelyn had become known for her empathy, her ability to listen without judgment. And though few knew her full story, her words often carried the weight of lived experience. Still, every now and then, she would think of Liam. They had met for coffee a few times after that message, awkward at first, but gradually warm. He had a quiet strength about him now, the kind that comes from surviving something unbearable. His limp was still there, but his spirit seemed lighter. One autumn afternoon, Evelyn sat across from Liam in a small cafe, the kind with rain-speckled windows and the smell of cinnamon in the air. "You ever think about how everything had to fall apart for us to become who we are now?" Liam asked, stirring his tea. Evelyn nodded slowly. "All the time. I used to hate that thought, that something good could come from so much pain. But now, I think it's the only way life really teaches us." He smiled faintly. "You were right back then, you know. When you said we weren't ready. I was angry, but maybe you saw something I couldn't." Evelyn looked down, emotions flickering in her chest. "Maybe, but that doesn't mean I was right to leave the way I did." Liam reached across the table, resting his hand over hers. "We both made mistakes, but we also grew. That has to mean something." For the first time, there was no shadow of the past between them. Just two people who had hurt, healed, and somehow found their way back to peace. Not as lovers, but as souls who once shared the same fire. That night, walking home through the amber glow of the streetlights, Evelyn thought about how forgiveness truly worked. It wasn't a single moment. It was a series of choices, choosing to let go of blame every time it tried to creep back in, choosing compassion over anger, choosing to see the good that had come from the wreckage. But she also knew life had a way of testing the lessons you thought you'd already mastered. The test came in the form of her new neighbor, a young woman named Iris who had just moved into the apartment next door. Iris was bright, ambitious, and painfully familiar. The way she spoke about her dreams, her independence, her refusal to settle for less. It all reminded Evelyn of herself at that age. They quickly became friends. But soon, Evelyn noticed signs of something darker beneath Iris's cheerful exterior: sleepless nights, tear-streaked cheeks, phone calls that ended in silence. One evening, Iris knocked on Evelyn's door, her eyes red. "Can I stay here for a while?" she asked softly. Evelyn nodded. "Of course." As Iris sat on the couch, clutching a blanket, she confessed everything. The relationship that had turned toxic, the lies, the betrayal, the guilt of walking away even though she still cared. Evelyn listened, her heart aching. It was as if she was watching her younger self sitting there. The same confusion, the same pain. "I feel like a terrible person," Iris whispered. "He says I ruined his life. Maybe he's right." Evelyn took her hand. "No, walking away doesn't make you cruel. Sometimes it's the bravest thing you can do. But what if I hurt him too much?" Evelyn paused, then said quietly, "Then you learn from it. You take responsibility, you grow, and you forgive yourself. Hurting someone doesn't define you. What you do after does." Iris looked at her with tear-filled eyes. "Did you ever hurt someone like that?" Evelyn smiled sadly. "Yes, and it took me years to forgive myself. But eventually I did." In the weeks that followed, Evelyn helped Iris rebuild, guiding her toward therapy, helping her find work, reminding her that healing was not linear. And in doing so, Evelyn found herself healing even more deeply. One evening, as they sat watching the sunset from the balcony, Iris said quietly, "I don't know how to thank you." Evelyn shook her head. "Just promise me one thing. When you're finally okay, and someone else is where you are now, help them. Pass it on." Iris nodded. "I will." Months later, Evelyn received a letter in the mail. It wasn't from Liam this time, but from Clara, his sister. "Evelyn, I wanted to tell you that Liam's doing incredibly well. He's been volunteering too, helping young people who've been through accidents. He often says your forgiveness saved him and has saved you. I think you both finally found peace." "Clara." Evelyn held the letter to her chest, tears slipping down her cheeks. For so long, she had carried her mistakes like stones in her pockets. Now, they felt lighter, as if each one had turned into a lesson she could hand to someone else. Years later, Evelyn published a book, The Weight of Forgiveness. It wasn't a memoir, but a collection of stories inspired by real people who had learned to forgive others and themselves. The final chapter, though unnamed, was clearly about her and Liam. It spoke of two hearts that collided, broke, and mended into something wiser. The book became a quiet success, not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. People saw themselves in the pain, the mistakes, the small victories. A signing event. A young man approached her with trembling hands. "Your book. It made me call my father after 3 years. I thought I'd never forgive him, but I did." Evelyn smiled, placing her hand over his. "Then that means it did what it was meant to." That night, Evelyn returned home and opened her balcony doors. The air was cool, filled with the scent of rain. Somewhere in the city, people were laughing, loving, hurting, healing. The endless cycle of human life continuing just as it always had. She closed her eyes, feeling gratitude wash over her. For the pain that once nearly destroyed her. For the man she'd hurt who found it in himself to forgive. For the stranger who became her mirror. For the lesson that life had carved into her soul. That karma is not punishment. It's education. Years down the line, long after her book had become a quiet legacy, Evelyn visited the rehabilitation center one last time. The halls were the same, but the faces were new. People learning to walk again, learning to live again. She walked to the garden where she had once sat crying years ago. Now, a plaque stood there with a quote from her book. "Forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It redefines it." She smiled softly, her heart full. As she stood there, she heard a familiar voice behind her. "I wondered if I'd run into you here." She turned. It was Liam, older, still walking with a cane, but smiling like the sun had found him again. "Hey," she said warmly. "Hey yourself," he replied. "I read your book." "Oh, what did you think?" He grinned. "You left out the part where I made better coffee than you." She laughed, shaking her head. "Some truths are too painful to publish." They sat on a bench, watching the golden light fade across the garden. Neither spoke for a long time. They didn't need to. Every word that had ever mattered had already been said. Years ago, through tears, through letters, through forgiveness. As the evening settled, Liam looked at her. "Do you ever regret how things turned out?" Evelyn thought for a moment, then shook her head. "No, because if we hadn't fallen apart, neither of us would have learned who we really are." He nodded slowly. "Then maybe we were never meant to last." just meant to teach. She smiled. Exactly. They sat there until the lights flickered on in the garden, surrounded by quiet peace. When Evelyn left the center that night, she looked up at the stars. They seemed brighter somehow, as if the universe itself was nodding in approval. She whispered into the night, "Thank you for every heartbreak, every lesson, every chance to grow." Because she finally understood, life's cruelest moments aren't the end. They are the beginning of wisdom, of empathy, of strength. And as she walked away, her heart light and full, the wind carried her words like a promise. What goes around comes back, not as punishment, but as purpose.